Napoleon's armies are taking over Europe. The German states armed themselves against the armies of the Revolution, but the French emperor handily defeats both Prussia and Austria. Among the enemy's ranks, there's an agent working for the military genius, Karl Ludwig Schulmeister. This former smuggler will eventually become chief of police. As a top agent in Napoleon's service, he risks his life between the fronts. Ulm, 1805. Austrian troops have invaded Bavaria. They're waiting for Russian reinforcements in order to launch a joint attack on France. The Austrian generals know nothing about the movements of the French in the West. Modern military technology that could determine the exact location of the enemy isn't available yet. But that's what spies are for. A German offers his services. Karl Ludwig Schulmeister. Allegedly, he knows exactly where the French emperor is and where he's going next. This kind of intelligence is crucial if one wants to conquer the enemy.
Schulmeister is the right man, in the right place, at the right time.
The Austrians feel safe in Ulm. They assume that the majority of the French troops are still far away. Nevertheless, Schulmeister offers his services at the right moment.
Since Schulmeister is a Badener, he knows everyone who's anyone, and so he manages to reach Ulm on his own. He recounts what he knows, and to wiggle his way further in, he embellishes a little. He wants to prove that he's useful.
Schulmeister is from Baden and lives in Strasbourg. As a merchant, he travels through many places and talks to lots of people. He can compile reports that are very different from what's possible for generals with the common techniques of that time.
On a basic level, military reconnaissance in the 18th century, and the 19th century as well, was characterized by the principal strategy of sending out so-called light troops, so hussars or uhlans or chauds légers, to perform reconnaissance ahead of the troops. So, what is the enemy doing? Or they would explore the terrain, find out where the roads are good, where they're bad, where there are bridges, paths located. How is the terrain?
Napoleon's army has received orders that the Austrians haven't anticipated. The Grand Army will bypass the Austrians in the north. Schulmeister is playing a refined game with the Austrians. He points to small groups of troops southwest in the Black Forest. Austrian scouts confirm his reports. Schulmeister seems credible. The Austrians give him some money and issue him passes. He's to continue to spy on the French. What they don't know, Schulmeister heads directly to the French camp to Marshal Joachim Murat.
On October the 16th, 4 days later, he meets with Murat. He gives him information about the Austrian troops and returns in secret to Ulm.
Schulmeister was on a secret mission at that time, for the French and against his German countrymen. Documents that he put together can still be found in the French military archive. They include a detailed description of the Austrian army's deployment, personally addressed to the French emperor, who was stationed in Augsburg. In mid-October 1805, the Austrians in Ulm are almost completely surrounded. Napoleon himself is stationed to the southeast in Augsburg. Escape is still an option because Ulm is not prepared for a siege. The walls are old, there are few supplies. Some officers advise Commander Karl von Leiberich to withdraw quickly. This is where Schulmeister comes into play.
He's delivered some information to Mack that should not only keep him from leaving, but also lead him to gather his troops to Ulm.
Because of Schulmeister, Mack von Leiberich believes that the small French contingents will soon leave again. Rumors are circulating that the English have landed on the French coast of the Channel. Moreover, it was said that an uprising against Napoleon had broken out in Paris. Mack already saw himself as the winner. A grave mistake. Completely surrounded, he is forced to surrender. Tens of thousands of Austrians are taken prisoner. Their armaments are seized by the French.
The fall of Ulm marks the beginning of the end for Austrian military presence on German territory.
In the end, the empire was robbed of its protective power, Austria.
But who is the mysterious man that helped Napoleon to this decisive victory? A man of whom only a few pictures have been passed down. Karl Ludwig Schulmeister was born in the German village of Neufreistadt on the right bank of the Rhine, not far from Strasbourg. He is the sixth son of a pastor. A calm life that proceeds at a leisurely pace seems predestined for this pastor's son. As the eldest brother was to take over the parish, Karl Ludwig was placed in service to the prince. He marries a woman from the Alsace. Despite all the turmoil, they will stay together until her death in 1844.
The young Karl Ludwig Schulmeister was sent to Cork to train as an actuary, accountant. He was an actuary for no longer than a year or two. By the time he was married in 1792, he had already become an ironmonger in Freistadt. That means he's not involved in smuggling yet, but he's probably thinking about it.
Karl Ludwig decides to resign from princely service shortly after his father's death. But the respectable iron trade is also not enough. It would become the facade for a new, adventurous life. At that time, the Rhine had not yet been straightened and forced into a bed. It's a wild river with many side branches, countless islets and hidden foothills. The activities taking place here could hardly be monitored. In short, this is the ideal terrain for a smuggler like Schulmeister, the pastor's son. He grew up in this border area, has friends and relatives to the right and left of the Rhine. And so his wife's Alsatian relatives also helped Schulmeister with his first covert action.
At the time, the two sides of the Rhine are still very closely linked. This, of course, has long-reaching historical roots, but it also has its roots in a trade across the Rhine, which was very active. And the common language has, of course, connected the two sides of the Rhine. And so the two banks of the Rhine are closely interwoven.
The dowry that his wife brought into the marriage also proves to be helpful. With her money, he can run his business in a grand style. Different prices, but above all different tax rates and duties are the ground on which his métier thrives. Alcohol, tobacco, textiles, handicrafts. Schulmeister smuggles everything that makes a profit. His winning manner, his charming nature, build up useful relationships. Gradually, he constructs a network of informants and officials who keep their eyes out for him or turn a blind eye, depending on what he needs at the moment. This is how one builds a career quickly.
Like the others, Schulmeister starts out as a delivery man, but rises quickly through the ranks. He's successful because he has the money for it, and so he quickly becomes the leader of the gang. He knows everyone who's anyone. And that's when it becomes clear to him that seeing the world is more important than just being a simple boss of a gang of smugglers. He's an entrepreneur, and above all, he's an insurer of smuggling. That means he assumes the risk of transporting the smuggling goods for his group. Above all else, he pays for the goods that are brought to the other side, a service comparable to that of Lloyd's for ships.
The river area is not only an ideal place for shady business dealings. The Rhine also marks the border between political systems. The many large and small principalities of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation on the one hand, and centrally ruled France on the other. The French Revolution has only exacerbated the opposition between Germany and France.
The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation had lower taxes than the Kingdom of France for products such as tobacco, iron, pottery and ceramics. With the revolution, many institutions disappeared, but the taxes remained. That is, the difference in tax revenues still favored the imperial side, so to speak.
After the revolution, the Rhine makes for a hotly contested border, perhaps the most contested around Europe. This is where revolutionary France clashes with old-fashioned princely rule.
So in 1789, the Rhine is still a very indeterminate border. There are enclaves on both sides and exclaves, and in this way the border is quite fluid. It's only with the revolution that the Rhine becomes a natural French border, and the border thereby becomes sharper and the demarcation clearer. And that's when it's finally possible to see Strasbourg as a bulwark of the French Revolution, and as a French city at all. There's a moment in July of 1790 when a sign is placed on the Rhine between Kehl and Strasbourg on the French side that says, "Ici commence le pays de la liberté."
An der Rheinbrücke zwischen Kehl und Straßburg auf und darauf steht, "Ici commence le pays de la liberté."
This is where the land of liberty begins. You couldn't mark that border any more clearly.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything, from the wonders of ancient Pompeii and the mystery of the princes in the tower to the life of Anne Boleyn and D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description.
As a free thinker, Schulmeister openly expresses his sympathies for this land of freedom. His home, under royal rule, is becoming too dangerous for him.
He has two problems. On the one hand, he's a smuggler, and a very successful one, which creates difficulties for the Neufreistadt village. Such behavior isn't acceptable. But above all else, he's working together with the French. In September 1797, he settles down in Strasbourg, for which he only has to cross the Rhine, so he doesn't have to go far.
An old imperial city in the Alsace, which was still German-speaking then, Schulmeister's new residence is a hotspot of the French Revolution.
Many Germans are enthusiastic about the French Revolution. And when they look towards France, the first thing they see is Strasbourg. Strasbourg is, so to speak, the first stop of the French Revolution. That is to say, those in Germany who are keen on the French Revolution see it as a starting point. And many, and especially those persecuted in Germany, then choose Strasbourg as the first place in their exile. And so it's fitting that there's a Jacobin club that they can join, that perhaps helps them with their first steps in a new country. And in this way, the Strasbourg Jacobin Club becomes a kind of instrument of propaganda to bring Germany into the revolution.
Wie ein Propagandainstrument, Deutschland in die Revolution einzubeziehen.
The revolutionary ideals in Strasbourg radiate, in particular to neighboring Baden, attracting men like Schulmeister. The former court actuary becomes a member of the Strasbourg Jacobin Club. But its heyday is already over.
He undoubtedly belongs to the Citoyen Actifs Club, because the Citoyen Actifs clubs are encouraged by the French army as it's about to occupy Baden.
During the wars of these years, military clashes on the Rhine keep happening. This is a stroke of luck for Schulmeister, because the French army values the smuggler's knowledge of the area.
Schulmeister has chosen to help the French army cross the Rhine. In May of 1796, French troops are on the left side of the Rhine, looking for suitable crossings to the other bank. There is a bridge between Strasbourg and Kehl, but they'd meet with resistance there. So one cannot cross the river unimpeded. This can only be done upstream.
Schulmeister's new trade is not without danger to himself. The local authorities now see him as a spy for the revolutionary arch-enemy to the west.
In a time when cartography was primarily for the military, and very incomplete as well, we also have to imagine that the normal path for moving troops could not be found easily. Civilian messengers were therefore forced to show the way, partly through money and partly with the threat of burning their house or village. There is, of course, quite a bit of leeway between those who volunteer, those who are coerced, those who are forced and yet richly rewarded, and those who can pretend they were compelled, although they may have done it voluntarily.
Whether it was for money or out of conviction for the liberal civic ideals of the revolution, Schulmeister helps the French cross the Rhine. And so, his career as a French 007 begins.
Schulmeister is the ideal candidate for French espionage. He agrees to do it. If this was out of necessity and under duress or due to his political sympathies, one still cannot say.
In these years, freedom, equality, brotherhood have long ceased to be the goals of the revolutionaries. The time when radical Jacobins set the revolution's direction through the guillotine is over. Now, the Jacobins, including those in Strasbourg, are just tolerated.
Jacobinism in France, and in Strasbourg as well, is a temporary phenomenon. The high point of Jacobinism is the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 94, when the Jacobins are in power. But the heights to which they climb are also the depths to which they fall. Robespierre is the prime example of how one can go from a high priest of the revolution to a victim of the guillotine. And that is, in a way, the fate of the Jacobins in general. Most clubs are closed in 1794, 1795, and former Jacobins are persecuted even. They were called terrorists then, as those who organized the terror.
Even after the end of the terror, uncertain times prevail. Then a stable government begins to emerge. The French Directory replaces Jacobin rule. The strong man of this time isn't Napoleon yet, it's the Vicomte de Barras. A former Jacobin becomes president of the police, the brutal Joseph Fouché. Whether it's out of opportunism or convictions, many reposition themselves at that time.
Schulmeister, lui, arrive à un moment.
Schulmeister arrives in a moment between 1797 and 98, when the French state isn't very solidified yet. A new coup d'etat is being prepared. Fouché is an agent of Barras, so the mastermind of the coup d'etat in 1797, who then becomes the first director in the five-man committee.
Et qui va devenir le premier directeur ensuite. Barras va vouloir se...
Barras wants to put an end to terrorism, especially that of the Jacobins, because they're determined and active.
Et les plus turbulents. Et donc va faire
It
en
is
sorte,
Fouché
et là,
who
c'est
takes care of the matter
cette affaire,
and makes
va
this
faire en sorte
opposition
que
disappear.
on fasse disparaître cette opposition.
Schulmeister recognizes the signs of the times. He plays a dubious role in the dissolution of the Jacobin Club in Strasbourg.
Ce que l'on sait, c'est que
Schulmeister becomes
quand il va
president
arriver à
of the
Strasbourg,
Jacobin
il va
Club,
devenir président du club
the club du citoyen actif, when he comes to Strasbourg. His role
encore une fois, n'est
isn't
pas
quite
clairement
clear,
établi, mais on sait très
but
bien
it is
qu'en
certain that
Afrique,
Schulmeister is
Schulmeister
used
dans
to
cette
dissolve
affaire-là,
the club.
c'est pour fermer cette affaire. On
The
sait
Club
que
des
le
Citoyens
16
in
mars
Strasbourg
1998,
disappears on March the
le club
16th,
Strasbourgeois
1797.
des citoyens actifs disparaît.
But his cooperation with the new rulers is of little use to him when the French customs agents start to notice his activities. He has to use his wife's fortune to pay his fines in order to avoid a longer imprisonment.
Ses activités
Whether it was his political activities or his smuggling that caused him the most trouble,
ou ses activités,
in any case, by 1804, in Strasbourg, he's ruined.
En 1804, il fait faillite.
In May 1805, he appears before the customs court.
Son affaire, et c'est une affaire de contrebande, va passer aux mains de la Cour
In
de
August
haute douane.
1805,
Et
he's
en
deported from
1805,
France.
Au mois d'août 1805, il va être expulsé de France.
The fact that a new war is coming must seem to him like a happy twist of fate.
Anne Jean-Marie René Savary is to prepare him, an officer with favourable memories of Schulmeister's excellent service in Strasbourg. Schulmeister's German origins and network to the east of the Rhine also speak in his favour. The smuggler is back in business.
For him, it doesn't matter if it's espionage or smuggling. It's still the same métier. And as soon as he's in Germany, he has his connections.
Des connexions.
In 1805, spies didn't have the same technical resources available to them as their fictional compatriots have nowadays.
James Bond n'existe pas.
There wasn't any James Bond yet. It's clear that Schulmeister had a network. His network was a network of smugglers, mainly insurers of smuggling. He meets people in the inns. That's where he makes connections with people he can use.
À partir du moment où il a ses entrées dans les auberges, il a ses entrées
People who
auprès des
can travel or have special positions and who can be used for information.
Ou parce qu'ils sont dans une place bien particulière pour s'occuper de renseignements.
Inns become his conspirational meeting places. This is where he recruits his informal staff, where he bribes and negotiates, where he passes on confidential information to his assistants. With his ways and means, he intervenes in major world events. After Ulm's capitulation, he continues to use his Austrian passes and letters of recommendation. After all, the Austrians still consider him to be their agent. This enables him to move unimpeded between Austrian contingents. Yes, Schulmeister even advises their general staff on tactical questions. His many successes are making him overconfident. He recruits a businessman in the pub. This time, however, Schulmeister, usually an excellent judge of character, is dangerously mistaken. His new informal employee goes straight to the Austrians. Schulmeister is arrested. He cannot hope for mercy now.
If one plays a double game like Schulmeister and actually acts outside these military hierarchies as well, one makes quite a dubious figure. It was clear that there was a distinction between a soldier engaged in military reconnaissance and a spy. A spy was to be shot immediately, and that was a constant threat for Schulmeister.
He is spared a court-ordered execution for the moment. The French are getting closer and closer. But the military prosecutor wants to interrogate him. Is Schulmeister a double spy? For whom is he really working? Who's part of his network? Schulmeister is transported by a troop of soldiers to Bohemia. When the French troops are dangerously close, the men beat up their prominent prisoner, rob him and leave him lying on the ground. Schulmeister makes his way to Vienna as a vagrant. These days, it's under the administration of the French military, which had proceeded unimpeded to the capital after its victory at Ulm. Savary receives his old friend with open arms, outfits him again, and makes him a prefect of police. A surprising turn in this extraordinary career.
It's certain that a suitable mediator has been found at just the right moment. Savary employs him, but not for espionage. He is to be in charge of public safety. Of course, his work for public safety includes some counter-espionage work.
Schulmeister ensures that food is distributed to the city's residents, who are suffering under the collapse of the Austrian administration.
It's a city that has lost all its officials, administrative and political, as well as its police. Thus, upon their arrival, the French must first ensure that the supply chains and public order are functioning in order to prevent a rebellion that would force them to keep their troops in Vienna.
The Viennese soon find some unusual reading material in their bookshops. In his new office, Karl Ludwig Schulmeister, the freethinker from Baden, finds himself longing for the old anti-aristocratic ideals. The new prefect of police has copies printed of the philosophical writings of the Enlightenment, which the Habsburgs had forbidden. After the peace in 1805, Vienna is vacated. Schulmeister wants to go back to France. A lavish reward awaits him there. He is now one of the many soldiers of fortune in the Napoleonic Empire that inherited the revolution.
One can almost say that the empire was the state of the parvenus, the social climbers. Napoleon himself was a social climber. Some of his closest followers were parvenus. Think of Fouché, who had begun his career as a physics teacher and then became Minister of Police. All people who had, so to speak, come from the bottom of society to the top. And so the empire stood for the opportunity to advance. Most of all in the military. If you were a gifted officer, you could rise to the top under Napoleon. In the state apparatus, which had been repeatedly cleansed by the revolution, many positions were available, and the so-called notables created a new elite. So in the end, Napoleon created a new nobility, the noblesse d'empire.
The rich pastor's son and ironmonger now belongs to this elite, and he returns to his wife in his Strasbourg home. In the suburb of Mainau, he buys a castle, as appropriate for his standing and to show his fellow citizens that he has made something of himself. But he keeps mum about the origin of his means.
Schulmeister tries to conceal the origin of his wealth. He doesn't say it comes from espionage, but from his work for the police. It's an affront to honest work in the city, according to public opinion.
He is denied public recognition, through the cross of the Honorary Legion, for example, or through a noble title.
Napoleon transformed the Republic into a monarchy. In 1804, he crowns himself emperor. The revolution had abolished the court, but Napoleon restored it. Napoleon bestows 2,200 titles of nobility, and he has created a new court ceremonial. And these are, of course, honorary posts in this new regime. But what distinguishes this new nobility from the old nobility is that it is no longer about origin, but about merit. And this change, this meritocratic elite, is quite decisive. Moreover, the new nobility has almost no privileges anymore, and as a rule, it is not hereditary.
Und ist in der Regel nicht erblich.
Schulmeister no longer has to worry about money. Recognition in the highest social circles, the officers, is now his goal.
The officers don't like him because he's treated like one of them, even though he isn't. He has a lot of money. The officers are not paid. That's why they tend toward corruption. It's more than resentment, it's total contempt for the spy.
And once again, Lady Luck smiles on Schulmeister, her protégé. Napoleon is preparing for the next campaign, and Savary takes his old friend and comrade-in-arms out of his bourgeois retirement. He's needed for the fight against Prussia, for his abilities, local knowledge, and, last but not least, his old connections in Germany.
In the army, Schulmeister appears to have no problems, since he's seen in the campaign of 1807. He fights and rides with the light cavalry, tasked with figuring out the appropriate path for the army.
Even among the troops, Schulmeister wears his civilian clothes. He never has to force himself into a uniform. His real mission is the administration of the conquered territories. In uneasy times, order is required. No insurrection can be allowed to break out behind the troops. And the war must feed the war. The conquered must pay for the slaughter at the front.
There had to be quarters for the soldiers, they had to be fed, payments had to be made. And if they weren't paying, or they weren't paying enough, the town or village was occupied by troops until the payments were made. In this respect, the brutal incentive to raise the funds called for in times of war prevailed to an extent.
According to the customs of war at the time, it was seen as appropriate to fill one's pockets as well. Schulmeister and Savary are no exception to this rule. Savary can be satisfied with his protégé. An extraordinary hussar operation is ascribed to Schulmeister during the conquest of Wismar. While Prussian troops are stationed in front of the city, Schulmeister gallops through the gates with a few horsemen and closes them immediately. He successfully leads the Prussians to believe that a large contingent of French troops is on the march. The frightened Prussians surrender to a small squad. The war against Prussia ends in 1807 with a complete defeat for Schulmeister's German countrymen. Prussia must submit to Napoleon. The French march to East Prussia. Savary will be governor there. He has already had good experiences with Schulmeister and the police. His best agent will now be chief of police in Königsberg. Schulmeister is one of the many effective cogs in Napoleon's system of domination.
Also man muss sich vorstellen, dass
So one has to imagine that this Napoleonic state is really a police state. That is, from the top down, the emphasis is put systematically on the procurement of information. And Napoleon's superiority in wars and in politics was often a superiority of information. Better maps, a better idea of where the enemy was located. For him, all this information was a means of domination and mastery. And in this respect, he systematically organized espionage and police surveillance. And Fouché's files, that famous central authority, was where all the information was gathered.
Zentralstelle eigentlich, wo alle Informationen zusammenlaufen, die steht eigentlich dafür.
Censorship of the press and its monitoring are important tasks for a chief of police and his staff. It must have surprised more than just the Königsberger that Schulmeister protected a local publisher who had ranted violently against the French. A last remnant of revolutionary freedom of thought? The fact is, it will benefit Schulmeister in later years.
Das Napoleonische Empire kam erstmal.
The Napoleonic Empire appeared at first to be a state of freedom under the rule of law. But if you looked into the realities, then of course it was something different. Firstly, it was no longer a republic, but an imperial empire beginning in 1804, and the various vassal states were also converted into monarchies. They had, in theory, constitutions. They had, in part, the civil code, and therefore modern, liberal elements. When one looks at what Napoleon really wanted from these vassal states, then it was above all two things, taxes and soldiers. And these two things burdened the population much, much more than the constitution and the Code Civil benefited them.
Viel mehr belastet, als sie die Verfassung und der Code Civil erfreut haben.
Napoleon transforms Germany radically. Soon the patchwork carpet of small and smaller principalities will no longer exist. The Confederation of the Rhine consists of devoted vassal states. In the autumn of 1808, Napoleon invites the rulers in his dominion and the Russian Tsars to a congress of princes in Erfurt. There is resistance among the people. Napoleon fears assassination attempts from nationalists. And so, Schulmeister is responsible not only for the accommodation, but also for the safety of the participants. His pleasant manners and experience in police work in his favor. Nobody knows the dark world behind the beautiful appearance of political productions as well as he does. The pastor's son is very close to the more and less powerful in Napoleon's circle.
In Erfurt, all the crowned heads of Europe are gathering for a congress. Therefore, any incident has to be prevented. For this, the activity of the police is directed more towards counter-espionage. And Schulmeister is very successful in this area, because he succeeds in hindering several not exactly assassination attempts, but problematic situations nonetheless.
The nationalist ideas that motivate political assassins have been imported from France. The Revolutionary Army had them in their satchels during their conquests all over Europe.
The appropriation of French nationalism is a quite particular subject. French nationalism had different elements. One component was liberty. The nation was the sovereign people. And on the other hand, in France, there was also this nationalism of culture, so that one felt, as a nation, separate from other peoples, felt superior to them, and basically lived out one's superiority through nationalism. The Germans rarely took up the freedom side of nationalism, but this other side, the feeling of us and exclusion, they took to very strongly.
Shortly after Erfurt, in April 1809, Napoleon goes to war once again. Against Austria once again. Vienna is bombarded extensively. The city must capitulate. The Austrian court flees to Hungary. The French return to the capital and must preserve public order. They bring an expert with them for a second time. Schulmeister is responsible for the police. But this time, his task is much more difficult. A very hostile mood against the French prevails. The citizens of Vienna have refused to surrender countless weapons, including cannons, and buried them in secret locations. Patriotic fanatics are planning assassinations. But the former smuggler knows exactly where the hiding places are.
And once again, public safety and counter-espionage are his main tasks. He even discovers an arms deal between Vienna and Russia. He's a police prefect or an imperial commissioner, so he dispatches his agents in order to penetrate the appropriate circles. He then performs the interrogations himself. In 1809, he conducts the interrogation of Friedrich Stabs, the Prussian who wanted to assassinate Napoleon.
Schulmeister maneuvers deftly between his people, between double and triple agents. The Vienna of those days is simply teeming with spies from countries all over the world. His duties soon extend beyond Vienna. He allegedly even went incognito to follow the Austrian imperial court to Hungary.
He continues to try to send his agents to Hungary to find out how the court is acting. The French are watching Hungary because they know that's where the emperor retreats to when Austria is attacked. So it's beneficial to be in a position to cause an uprising in Hungary, in order to create unrest in the bosom of Austrian power.
Schulmeister's knowledge of people is his most important weapon. He recognizes their weak points, knows how to win people over first, and how to put them under pressure later.
So the resources of the police at that time are more limited than today's. But of course you can infiltrate the circles you think are dangerous with undercover agents, so you can build contacts in dangerous milieus. Writings, everything that is published, can be carefully examined and evaluated. And of course, there's the powers of the executive, that is to say, the power to arrest, to send into exile, that is, all the tools needed to muzzle one's enemies.
The peace agreement with Austria ends his job in Vienna. He returns and acquires another property, this time near Paris, People Castle. This is where he wants to enjoy his glory and wealth. His name is now known throughout Europe, but he himself remains a phantom. It's suspected that the mysterious master spy is behind many operations. Because there is still no photography, no modern means of communication that could quickly spread his image around the world.
It's known that Schulmeister exists, but who calls him Schulmeister? He can call himself Schulmacher or Schulmeister. Spellings are not fixed at this time. When a person is discussed for the first time, their name will be noted in different ways. Schulmeister is unknown to the Austrians. Although he was a prefect of police, there are reports with descriptions of Schulmeister that do not correspond to the known descriptions of him. For the Austrians, Schulmeister is everywhere and nowhere.
This will also prove to be helpful with his next assignment. Fouché has to resign because he has conducted intrigues behind Napoleon's back. Napoleon's favorite, Savary, becomes the new Minister of Police. And Savary sends his protégé Karl Ludwig to Hamburg, which has been annexed by the French. Napoleon has set a trade embargo against Great Britain. But the people of Hamburg are resisting the continental blockade and continue to trade in secret. Prohibited goods that the French track down are burned in public. Especially devious, Savary prints fake pound notes and gives them to Schulmeister.
In 1812, Savary has a task for Schulmeister, his henchman and representative. So Schulmeister heads to Hamburg. He knows Hamburg because he was there between 1805 and 1809. He knows the traders that he can pass the fake pound notes to, which are to be spent on the other side of the channel.
Savary and Schulmeister want to disrupt trade and cause damage to the United Kingdom. And they both want to make a profit out of it as well. In the meantime, Napoleon is preparing a campaign against Russia. Will he take Schulmeister with him?
Military espionage is for a limited time. A war is begun and espionage activities start, and they also end with the end of a campaign. Schulmeister was of use for the wars in Germany in 1805, 1807 and 1809. But when Napoleon wants to invade Russia, he needs other personnel. The Poles prove useful for this. People from the respective country are used to carry out espionage within it.
With the catastrophic outcome of the campaign in the bitter Russian winter, the self-declared emperor's unstoppable decline begins. At the end of this war, Prussians, Russians, and Austrians march into the French capital and restore the rule of the old royal house of the Bourbons that had been swept away by revolution. The Allies treat the many followers of Napoleon with mercy. Schulmeister, on the other hand, is regarded by the Prussians and Austrians as a traitor to German interests, and he has to go into hiding. In Paris, he hides himself from his potential captors. His two beautiful castles are no longer of use to clever Karl Ludwig. The Austrians are looking for him. And it's not just them. Ulm, Vienna, Wismar, Königsberg, and Hamburg. He hasn't been forgotten, even though no one knows his picture.
The Prussians, who were treated poorly during his anti-Prussian activities in Königsberg, also want to get a hold of him. But the problem is that they neither know who he is nor where they can find him.
But he gets lucky again. Men with his abilities are always needed. Prussia and Austria both want to grab the Alsace for themselves, and for this the top agent from Strasbourg could prove quite useful.
The Austrians tried to use him for their purposes during the First Restoration in 1814. An anti-Prussian network is to be built on the left side of the Rhine. But Schulmeister says, "I have nothing more to do with these things," and refuses to act. We know of a meeting which took place in 1812 between a messenger from Metternich and Schulmeister. But there's no information about the outcome of the meeting. In any case, Schulmeister did not accept.
The Austrians want to recruit Schulmeister. The Prussians want to imprison him. His castles are looted by Prussian soldiers. All his wealth is in danger. Many upstarts managed to retain the wealth that they collected under Napoleon. And there are many opportunists who are reinstated in public office under the new rule. Karl Ludwig Schulmeister, on the other hand, might lose everything. His supporters can no longer protect him. Will he and his family end in misery? During the trip, he is taken from his carriage and arrested by the Prussians. He's brought to Wesel, where he's interrogated. The Commission of Inquiry concludes that one cannot accuse Schulmeister of violating the rules of war. Königsberg's citizens put their support for him in writing. Now, what he did for the local publisher pays off, but his life in the lap of luxury is over.
The Prussians plunder his house. They take the diamonds and money with them, which means that the situation is difficult for Schulmeister when he comes back to Strasbourg. The classic paranoia of the police comes up again. Since he was an agent of Bonaparte, he's kept under surveillance until 1830.
Schulmeister has lost everything. He lives a reclusive life in his Strasbourg home. In 1816, he publishes his memoirs. They're only an apologia that's not very historically meaningful. He even goes so far as to claim that he never spied. Advanced in years, he dies in 1853 and is buried in Strasbourg. Today, Napoleon's German 007 is remembered with a park and a street in Strasbourg. The decades to come would see in him sometimes a hero, sometimes a traitor, depending on what they needed him to be.
Is he a double agent? A French spy? Is he a traitor? A lively dispute is carried out during the Franco-German crises and wars between 1810 and 1914. A competition of memories exists around Schulmeister and is primarily a Franco-German competition. Schulmeister is an extraordinary godsend for all who want to show that he belonged to one side or the other. For in this way, he can be made into a hero.
French television discovers this important but also typical figure of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1970s. Karl Ludwig Schulmeister becomes the main character in a popular adventure series. The historical documents present a more complex image. Karl Ludwig Schulmeister lived in an epoch in which the idea of the nation was just beginning to form, an epoch in which the ideas of the French Revolution inspired many clever minds. Schulmeister took the side of this revolution. Was it out of conviction or a desire to advance his career? Who knows? Karl Ludwig Schulmeister actively seized the opportunities that a period of upheaval offers to those who recognize and know how to use them. With Napoleon, he advanced. With Napoleon, his wealth, fame, and career were also ended.